The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you, and enjoy. I wanted to share a classic teaching story. I shared this one at the day along on Saturday, and I think kind of reflects an important part of this practice, this training in mindfulness. It's the story of a woman one evening who is walking down the street as it's getting dark, and she almost steps on a snake in the middle of the road. Completely freaks out. Came, so close to stepping on the snake, and runs home. Spends the entire night just shaking in fear of how close she came to really, harming herself or maybe even dying. The next morning is still filled with a lot of trepidation. She starts down the same street, and she sees that the snake is a piece of rope. And of course, the analogy of that story is how many snakes in our lives are actually ropes. And how much this practice it's all about learning how to see clearly. This practice of meditation or mindfulness, if you will, is really a study of reality. Well, what is actually true? There are so many things that feel real, but are they true? And in order to really pursue that as a personal mission, requires a lot of rigor. And there are lots of experiences that come up in life that look like one thing, but they may be something else. And that becomes part of the power of the practice, is when you have the courage and the energy and the interest and the so forth to look closely at things, you begin to see that what it looks like on the surface isn't what it's like underneath. You realize, that story of anger that I have towards someone, wow, well, there's actually hurt. There's actually a really deep unmet need. There's a whole story of what the other person's experience is that I wasn't aware of. All of that begins to become more clear the more you're willing to really look at what arises in your life. That desire to know what's true is so critical. And so, of course, the practice is all about refining our awareness and really dialing in what is actually true. Here's my story, but is my story true? This is what I believe, but is what I'm believing really true? This is what I'm feeling, but is this feeling really a reflection of truth? It reminded me of how, when I was a kid, I would spend time with a family. We were very close, and they had one of the old-fashioned shortwave radios, a big Grundig shortwave radio. It was fascinating to me as a little boy. All the different stations you could tune into. But I remember that this Grundig radio had a big knob for tuning in the stations, but then had a smaller knob where you could fine-tune the station. And there's something about the practice that when we look closely and we really bring in a real desire to see what's actually there, well, then sometimes we need to switch to the fine-tuning knob and really see, is that really what I perceive it to be? So I'd like to talk about tonight something that I think can be very, very helpful as you refine your own investigation. And it has to do with what are called the near enemies in spiritual practice. The states that look like a state, but they're slightly off. And that slightly off can be very informative for refining your attention. So I'd like to talk a little bit, with the little time I have, about what gets in the way of being awake in your life, and to talk about the near enemy of four states. These are often referred to as in Pali, it's referred to as the Brahma Viharas. One way to describe them is the immeasurable states, they're qualities of the heart. So the near enemy of kindness, and the near enemy of compassion, the near enemy of what's called sympathetic joy, of being the joy you feel for yourself, but the joy you feel for others, and the near enemy of equanimity. As I was reflecting on what can arise in our practice and what looks and feels real, it reminded me of a retreat I was on, a month-long retreat a number of years ago. Sort of like week 3, and again, all in silence, and I was getting very, very concentrated and very focused. And when you experience really deep, sustained concentration, there can be all kinds of phenomena that arise. And in this tradition, they're referred to as the jhanas. They're states of access concentration that can be very, very pleasurable and really wonderful stuff. And you can't make it happen. You just get very concentrated, but when you sustain that concentration, the first quality that arises is described as an upwelling. There's sort of an upwelling of well-being. You're sort of in this non-desiring state, and it's just exquisite. And I had moments of feeling that, of just getting very concentrated, feeling that sort of like non-desiring, blissful state. But I'd feel it in little pieces. But then for some reason, it just came on really, really strong. And it's a feeling of joy, a very intense feeling of joy. And I remember thinking, this is it. Like any moment now, I'm going to be just fully blown, awakened. And it was just this ecstatic moment of just feeling so much joy, like there's no desire for anything other than what it is. And that sense of just sort of waiting, like any moment, this is something even greater is going to happen. And then I got hungry for lunch. And then I went to lunch. And I realized that state that I thought I had arrived at, this sort of permanent state of bliss, was yet just another transient wave. It was just another part of the weather system coming through. It was kind of a little humiliating, but also a little liberating. And also just sort of finding that when those states of bliss come, and they do come from time to time, and recognizing that they're impermanent was very, very helpful. There's a classic story of someone who goes to their meditation teacher and says, all I'm experiencing is just sadness and disappointment and so much despair. And the teacher says, keep practicing, see if it changes. And then 2 days later, the practitioner comes back and says, oh my God, I'm feeling so ecstatic and so grateful and so present. And the teacher says, keep practicing, see if it changes. And that recognition of how all conditioned things change is really valuable. But I imagine we've all had those moments, those, the magical moments in your life that are special, and they change. So the practice is very much around looking at reality, really studying reality. That experience I had of what I thought was enlightenment, when I sort of ran that through the characteristics of reality, the first being anicca, or impermanence, recognizing, this is not a permanent state, it's an impermanent state. The second characteristic of reality is referred to as dukkha, or the stress or suffering that occurs whenever you hold on to something. And so I got to experience that. This was a state I was really looking for and wanting, and then the disappointment when it just sort of was like sand through my fingers. And then the characteristic of what is called anatta, which is really looking closely at who is it that's having that experience, which can be quite a frustrating but quite a liberating inquiry. So in your practice, the only choice you really have is keep going, keep looking, and see what occurs. And of course, we all know that there are some wonderful byproducts to this practice. On a physiological level, it's very, very clear through all the studies that when you practice meditation, your body comes into much more of a sense of homeostasis, much more of a sense of optimal functioning. We know that emotionally, your emotional equilibrium gets stronger, that you can experience a strong emotion, but then that non-judging awareness brings you right back again. And we know that mentally, it affects your clarity, how you perceive, and your intuition becomes more alive. But there are other qualities that occur. Quite often, it's really that focus on sort of body and mind and emotion, but part of the emotion is what this practice can do for your heart, for your sense of kindness and compassion and joy and equanimity. And these states are described as the immeasurable states, that when you investigate kindness, when you're really exploring like loving kindness, and you're really inside it, if you really look and sense and feel, you realize there's no limit to it. In those moments when you feel yourself infused with kindness toward yourself, kindness toward others, very powerful practice. So there's a really beautiful distinction between what are called the far enemies of these states and the near enemies of these states. So when you're cultivating loving kindness, the far enemy is hatred. That's kind of the opposite. When you're cultivating compassion toward yourself and toward others, well, the far enemy is cruelty. When you're developing joy for yourself and for others, well, the extreme far enemy is schadenfreude, where you're actually taking delight at the suffering of others. And equanimity, that quality of steadiness no matter what is occurring, well, the far enemy could be paranoia, which is utterly a self-absorbed state. So there's an interesting thing of how when you practice, again, just practicing non-judging awareness in any given time over a sustained period of time, what many people report is that there's a natural arising of loving kindness and compassion and joy and equanimity. It's sort of a organic process. But you can also do specific practices that cultivate these. You can actually take on the training of the heart, which can reveal your resistance to these states, but also really open up your capacity in pretty dramatic ways. In that same way, when you focus on developing loving kindness toward yourself, inevitably, when you look closely, what's revealed to you is everything that isn't. It will reveal your pettiness, your meanness, your judgment, all of that. So it's not a practice for the faint of heart, but it can be really quite freeing. So those are kind of the far enemies, but I'd like to take you on a little tour of the near enemies that can be, I've certainly found them to be helpful. So one of the qualities that we're encouraged to cultivate in this practice is referred to as metta. And the word metta, M-E-T-T-A, has at its root the word metta, and the word metta in Pali refers to friendliness. So you take upon this practice of really exploring being friendly toward yourself, being compassionate toward yourself, and then practicing offering that out to others. It's a challenging practice. As we've explored before, starting with yourself, we hold ourselves with so much derision. But when we can heal that, it's really quite powerful. My favorite quote on that is from Garrison Keillor, who wrote his parents when he was in college and said, "Dear Mom and Dad, I want you to know you no longer have to criticize me. I have completely internalized your voices, and I'm doing it for you from now on." So when you really see just how much you live in a state of constant self-judgment, constant self-criticism, it's quite appalling. But over time, that mechanism, self-judgment, can begin to soften, and new states can open up. So this practice of loving kindness is a really worthy practice. There's a phenomena that occurs on meditation retreats, and when you go to an intensive retreat, we usually address it in the very beginning. Sometimes it's referred to as the VMR or the MMR, the meditation retreat, the MRR, the meditation retreat romance, where you're in silence, but what happens is, as you're really paying attention and as you're beginning to soften, as your heart is beginning to open up, someone is going to stand out as really special. And then you find yourself beginning to project onto that person. So as we say, you can, over the course of 7 days or 10 days or a month, you can fall in love, court someone, marry them, have children, and divorce them without ever talking to them. But relationship and intimacy becomes a very powerful mirror for that experience of loving kindness. And there's a very interesting dynamic that I've noticed over many, many years. And that is when you are with an intimate partner and one person really gets turned on by this practice of meditation and non-judging awareness. And they go to a retreat and things fall away and new possibilities arise and they go back to their partner. And oftentimes there's really only a few options. Either the other partner, they see what's changed and their response is, "Tell me what happened because I really want to know. There's a lot of light coming through you." Sometimes it's the opposite, where the other person feels threatened by that. I think on some level they're thinking, what demons would I have to encounter if I had that much sense of freedom inside? So it's not uncommon sometimes in relationships when one person has a really active, alive practice and a real desire to feel more alive and more vibrant, that the other person can feel threatened by it. And quite often what occurs in our personal, intimate relationships is that we have that initial experience of unconditional love, where you're totally on for your partner's happiness, they're on for your happiness, and there's a real sense of harmony that flows between you. What can occur sometimes is when that sense of unconditional love starts becoming conditional. And here we begin to see sort of a shift from the pure state of loving kindness into the sense of conditional loving kindness. And again, it has to do with attachment. We have some attachment that begins to infiltrate our relationships. So love, you could say, is selfless, And attachment has a quality of selfishness to it. Love has a quality of liberation, and attachment is controlling. Love is a quality of timelessness, and attachment it's encumbering in some way. And love, when we're really feeling that, it reduces the ego. And attachment is what kind of boosts the ego. It boosts our personal narrative. And so it becomes a very interesting thing to look at what you feel are your most loving relationships and to really inquire, is that truly unconditional love? Or is there some form of attachment? Is there some form of conditional love that plays into this? There's freedom that comes in seeing this. But it can be a very, very helpful, and part of course, navigating a relationship is naming all the subtle ways that where the attachment or the ego or the conditioning comes in. So just maybe a short reflection. We'll just take a minute or so. If you like, you can close your eyes. And when you reflect on those who are the closest in your life, is there a sense of loving kindness? Does it feel unconditional? Is there a quality of selflessness, of freedom, kind of losing the ego? Or are there elements where you feel a sense of control? Some kind of binding quality? And whatever you find, whatever you notice, just to hold that as best you can in a spirit of non-judging awareness. And if you like, you can deepen the breath. And you can open the eyes. That assessment of looking at this state of love and loving kindness and noticing where it may be infiltrated by conditions can be very helpful. There's a beautiful quote from Rilke who says, "Do not look for love. Seek only to find the barriers to love and address those." So another element that we are encouraged to cultivate is compassion. As I reflected on this, it reminded me of somewhat of a humiliating story of my own. I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa for a number of years, and I did a lot of photography. So I was able to travel around the country of Niger and document a lot of the Peace Corps activities and so forth. It was their 20-year anniversary, so I was out there getting to visit a lot of different places. And I remember one of the things that so surprised me was kind of the degree of happiness that people had in the rural villages. And it seemed to me that there was a quality of that people were as happy or happier than people I knew back in the United States. And it had something to do with belonging, a real sense of people seemed to really belong to where they lived. I was also aware of how, like in the cities, there was sort of the Western disease of wanting. If you didn't have a bike, you wanted a bike. If you had a bike, you wanted a moped. If you didn't have a moped, you wanted a motorcycle. And you could sort of see the difference between the rural and the urban experiences. It was also a brutally poor country. In Niger, the growing season is only 90 days. The second highest infant mortality rate. There was slavery, there was female genital mutilation, there's a huge, huge stuff going on. But I found that when I traveled, I felt very comfortable. Everywhere I went, I seemed really welcomed, and I always felt kind of good about that. And it was only years later that I realized that part of why I felt so comfortable wherever I went was that I was sort of like the alpha white guy wherever I went. Everyone was deferential to me. And I realized how I assumed that role so easily because it felt good. Who doesn't enjoy being the alpha? But I realized that what I sort of felt was compassion as I was traveling. We also had a strong element of what is called the near enemy of compassion. And then the near enemy of compassion is pity. On some level, I was holding myself superior wherever I went. And even though I was touched by what I saw, I was also holding myself separate and looking down on it. There was a level of purity that I wasn't able to access or feel. So when you're exploring compassion, and what it really means to be with another in their suffering, pity can look so close to compassion, but it's not compassion. And just to notice, is there a self in there that is separating you from another, that is looking through that lens of somehow looking down or holding yourself separate? There's another quality to this near enemy of compassion, and it has to do with despair. And that is that when you're with someone who is suffering, that if you're pulled into sort of like a vortex of despair around their suffering, that's not true compassion either. That's really being identified with the other person. So it's such a delicate thing to be able to be with another in their suffering without holding yourself separate and without getting over-identified. So another quality that we are encouraged to cultivate, in Pali it's called upekkha, and it speaks to joy, and particularly to sympathetic joy. And this is one of the byproducts, again, of non-judging awareness. When you are really, really present, what happens is desire falls away. When desire falls away, then what arises can be a profound sense of contentment. And that contentment can blossom into a really profound feeling of joy. Just the celebration of here and now. So you can cultivate this quality of joy for yourself, to celebrate the positive and wholesome states that you experience. But it goes beyond that. It's also training yourself to feel sympathetic joy for other people when they feel those states as well. A number of years ago, I got an email from one of my best friends from high school. And he said, "Hey, my third book is coming out this spring. I'm really excited. I think it's my best one yet." So I wrote him back. And I said, "I'm really happy for you, my friend. I can't imagine the sense of accomplishment you must feel. Let me know when it's out and I'll buy it immediately. Congratulations." That's what I wrote. What did I actually feel? My basic internal narrative was, what about me? It's easy for you to write a book. You're a full-time professor. Your whole career is supporting you in writing, And also like Peter, our other friend, who got to write his book because he's a trust fund baby and he can afford all the time off. I've had to work for a living. I've had to sacrifice more than you to try and do the same thing. And absolute opposite of sympathetic joy. It was getting lost in comparison. The good news is, I didn't say that out loud. The inside thoughts didn't become outside thoughts. And I had enough mindfulness to see, to sort of gauge, oh my gosh, this really triggered something inside of me. But we can train ourselves in sympathetic joy. My friend's joy, his success, triggered something very much around my own ego. What about me? Why not me? But that training can be very powerful. So a little reflection on sympathetic joy, if you like. You can close your eyes. So you might take a moment with your eyes closed, just to deepen your breath, and take a moment to think of something that you're proud of, something that you have done really well, something you're really good at. And take a moment just to think on that. And as you breathe into that, can you amplify that feeling of accomplishment? A wonderful way to begin to cultivate the sense of sympathetic joy is to think of a child or a young person that you really care for. And take a moment to imagine that child learning something new and the feeling inside that may begin to form as you reflect on how the joy or the sense of accomplishment in that child makes you feel on the inside. And you might just ask, how big could that feeling get? And now you might bring into mind someone you know who's had some recent success, some recent accomplishment. And take a moment just to sense, how do they feel? How do you imagine they would feel on the inside? Activating your mirror neurons. And is it possible just to feel or imagine their own sense of joy or accomplishment? And to make room for that. And you might imagine just the possibility as you encounter people in your daily life, and those who are having success, those who are having a sense of accomplishment, of what it might be like just to pause and really feel their sense of well-being, and to celebrate that, and to wish them well. And then if you like, you can deepen the breath. And if you like, you can let your eyes open. So the whole trick to these states is really noting that what gets in the way of the pure experience of loving kindness and compassion and joy is some tightly held sense of self. where we hold ourselves separate. Our day-long retreat here on Saturday was called No I and Mine, and the exploration of what is it like when the sense of I and mine falls away. And true loving kindness and compassion and joy, they're only available when we can sort of drop our sense of an individual self and open to another. And they can open up profound states of presence and intimacy and aliveness. So the last one, equanimity, I'm aware of just a few minutes. But equanimity is considered the flower of the practice. And so what is equanimity? Someone said, does that have something to do with horses? No. It's equanimity is referred to, again, it's sort of like the fruit, it's the flower of the practice. And it has to do with the quality of steadiness of presence. No matter what the externals, that quality of presence that pervades all the modifications of the mind and emotions and so forth. So cultivating that sense of your capacity to let it all be, to allow your life to be in a flow state. Very subtle stuff. When a friend of mine, many years ago, there was I forget what the political strife was, but I lived in New England and had a friend living in a very small New England town. And there was a little corner place where he would go every morning for his coffee and buy the New York Times. And all the little people in this village of West Stockbridge in Western Mass they sort of go and buy the paper and the coffee and hang out. And my friend went down to buy the New York Times and his coffee, and the shopkeeper said, no one's buying the paper anymore. And he said, why is that? He said, people are telling me they just can't read the newspaper because it's so upsetting. Or if they do, they just read the sports page. What this sort of speaks to is the near enemy of equanimity, and that is indifference. What can look like a sense of ease and allowing, very, very close, is indifference. Some form of disassociation from what's happening. And again, it's sort of like that second knob of dialing it in. Am I really letting this be, or am I just pulling back? And of course, there's a shadow side to this, where we just simply disassociate. But here the practice gets very, very interesting, because we also need to bring a sense of compassion to ourselves. As I've shared before, there is something called compassion fatigue, which it is noted as a real thing. That when you are surrounded by suffering, your system needs to shut down because it can't take it anymore. So with all the turmoil we're going through right now, I don't know about you, but there are times when I just have to stop. I have to put it away. It's like drinking out of a fire hose. There's so much going on right now. So indifference is not a form of deep steadiness of presence. It's a form of disassociation. And when you notice yourself moving into indifference, it really calls for more investigation. What is it that I'm not willing to feel? What am I needing to re-engage into the fullness of my life? And there's an interesting thing too, and this becomes a real trap in spiritual practice, because we all want those states of feeling the mystery of life. We all want to feel more love and increased kindness and compassion, and cultivate that sense of steadiness, that quality of happiness that's unconditioned. And so the temptation is to move into what's called premature transcendence, or spiritual bypassing, where we just sort of ignore what's really happening and we find ourselves missing something really important, where we'll bypass someone being unskillful toward us, and we don't acknowledge the anger, or we don't acknowledge the hurt because it's not spiritual, because I want to get to that place of unconditional love. I remember once standing in line in the ashram and someone cut in front of me, and I thought, oh, well, I guess they're really they have something really important going on. It must be their karma that they cut in front of me. And meanwhile, I was fuming inside. So to be aware of that can be very, very helpful. So these states, they masquerade as a real spiritual realization. But they're really only an imitation. So to remember that the enemy of loving kindness is attachment. That attachment may feel like love, but it may have qualities of clinging or control or fear. The near enemy of compassion is pity. That also creates a sense of separation. Oh, I feel so sorry for that person over there. You've just cut off something from that pure experience of compassion. The near enemy of sympathetic joy, or your capacity to be happy for others, is comparison. Comparing yourself, which immediately puts you in a box. And the near enemy of equanimity is indifference. Losing that sense of balance. So the courage it takes to look really closely at the subtlety of what occurs can be challenging work, but it can also open you to a much more intimate experience of life and a much more clear perception of what is real and what is true. So why don't we close with a short yet brief reflection. You might take a breath and notice where you feel the breath. And in these final moments this evening, just to tune in to this quality of loving kindness and sensing the purity of what it means to be kind to yourself, to everyone you meet, and to all beings. Your capacity for compassion, to be with others even in their suffering. Your capacity for joy, to increase your own capacity for that resonant joy of presence, and to be more and more sensitive to celebrate the joy of all those around you. And this quality of equanimity, a steadiness of heart and mind, a quality of presence that is unwavering, no matter what the externals. In these final moments, you might imagine these qualities increasing in intensity, informing your life. And offering those qualities out to all beings in all directions. May all beings know kindness and compassion and joy and this steadiness. When you're ready, you can gently deepen your breath. And as you're ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you so much. Enjoy your evening. I have a sense there may be some cookies out there. Yes, thumbs up on the cookies. And enjoy the coming weeks with our visiting teachers. I look forward to seeing you later in the fall.